Hello everyone. I'm very happy to present Liz Frissell. She's a doctoral researcher from the University of Nottingham. Today she's going to present a chapter of her thesis. The title is Accepting First Movements, How Stoicism Can Improve ACT. She's going to present for 45 minutes and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first start off, I just want to thank you all for coming. I appreciate it's not term time. So thanks for coming here when you could have been relaxing at home or doing things. Thank you also to everyone on Zoom. I went to 2 years of university on Zoom, so I can appreciate that online lectures are terrible. So I really appreciate you coming to this one. Before we get started, I just want to share a little bit more about myself. Before any of this, though, as you might know or have assumed from my accent, I'm American. I just want to tell all of you that I'm deeply horrified and saddened by pretty much everything the US government is doing, both domestically and internationally. So hopefully we're all on the same page about that. And also just to reassure you all that I'm not a lunatic. Anyways, so in 2022, I graduated from Frissell College, which is a super small liberal arts school in California. And there I studied philosophy and cognitive science, which is kind of where all of my research comes from, this overlap of philosophy and psychotherapy. Then in 2023, I finished my MA at the University of Nottingham in England. My MA thesis was focused on Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy. So my current PhD thesis is kind of just building off of that. I'm meant to graduate in March of 2028. We'll see if that happens. Please pray for me. But my current supervisors are Matthew Duncombe, who's an ancient philosopher, right French, who's currently starting this new subfield of philosophy of mental health, and then Dr. Sarah Gunn, who's both a professor of psychology and a practicing acceptance and commitment therapy therapist. So they're a wonderful team. And then just a couple of the organizations I'm involved in. So there's a Health Humanities Research Cluster, the Philosophy of Mental Health Research Center, the Society for Women in Philosophy UK, and the Society for Applied Philosophy. I just bring those up in case anyone's interested in any of those, if anyone's planning a trip to the UK and want to get involved, please let me know. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn and Phil People. Embarrassingly, those are the only social medias I have. And if you want to get in contact, there's my email. But enough on me. To jump into the research, quick roadmap of this presentation. First, I'll be giving a project overview, so what my thesis is looking at and how this chapter I'm presenting on fits into that. A bit about Stoicism and a bit about acceptance and commitment therapy, just in case anyone doesn't know anything about any of those, just so we're all on the same page. Then I'll be looking at a little bit of the history of Stoicism and modern psychotherapy. Then I'll be talking about the main Stoic idea I want to present, which is this idea from Seneca, his first movements. And then I'll be talking about how first movements can fit into ACT, both in its theory and also in psychotherapeutic practice. And then will be the conclusion. So that's that. Project overview, as promised. So the aim of my thesis is really just answering this one main question: how can Stoic ideas and practices be used to improve acceptance and commitment therapy? Seems like a simple question. Of course, it implies a lot of other ones, like what is Stoicism? Which Stoic ideas? Which Stoic practices? What is acceptance and commitment therapy? How can Stoicism be used for psychotherapies at all? Should it be used at all? What potentially do Stoicism and act already have in common. So those are, broadly speaking, a lot of the different things I talk about in my thesis. And then how this relates to the presentation today is just giving one answer to this question of how can Stoic ideas and practices be used to improve. That's it. And a quick little background on Stoicism. So it is one of the Hellenistic philosophies. It started in Greece in about the 3rd century BCE by Zeno of Citium. It lasted there, later moving into Rome, where it really flourished until around the 3rd century CE. I'm not particularly a historian, but my understanding of why it ended is that the Christians came in. Although I've been talking to quite a few theologians, so there's definitely some ways in which Stoicism influenced Christianity. That's a bit off topic. And yeah, like most Hellenistic philosophies, Stoicism has its own complete ethical theory and ethical practice, its own complete metaphysics, and its own complete logic. Of course, these are categories we're placing on it more modernly. Stoics didn't think about it in exactly these terms. So in that way, these 3 different parts of the philosophy are all very much interlinked. A point I really like to make, and if you only remember one thing from this talk, is that big S Stoicism is not equivalent to little s Stoicism. So little s Stoicism, the English word Stoic, right? It means someone who's not showing emotion, or maybe someone who's not feeling emotion. This is not all what big S Stoicism means, right? First of all, because of what I've already said, right? Stoicism is a lot more than just working on the emotions, right? It's also a metaphysical theory. It's also a logical system, but also because even the Stoic stage, the ideal person was still meant to experience eupatheia, right? Good emotions, feelings like joy or caution at the right moments. So even a Stoic sage, if one were to exist, which is a whole nother debate, would still feel emotions, would still not be little s Stoic. And then in terms of my thesis project, I mainly focus on Stoic ethics, because that's what's most applicable to psychotherapy. And then also works from what's considered the late Stoa. That's for kind of 2 reasons. First, it's what we have the most surviving texts of. But second, it's because it's during this time period in Rome where Stoic ethics really developed the most. Sorry. I've been doing a residency, so I haven't spoken more than 20 words to anyone, I think, in well over a week. So I need a bit of water. But yeah, another point I always love to share, I'm sorry that this is really just a very nerdy presentation of my niche interests, is that you might be thinking, what does this picture have to do with anything? Is this just some random AI generated presentation? No. So fun etymological fact, Stoicism comes from the ancient Greek word stoa, which means porch. So when they were naming the philosophy, usually, right, these philosophies are named after the founder. For some reason, not entirely clear, the word Zenoism was not going to work. Maybe it didn't sound that great. Pronunciation, maybe it sounded a little too close to the word otherism, and they thought that was bad branding. Not exactly sure. So they picked Stoicism because the original Stoics met on the Stoa, on the porch. So that's all I'll say. We still call it Stoicism, but maybe we should call it Porchism. That's Stoicism. Moving on to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is a 3rd wave psychotherapy that was started in 1982 by American psychologist Stephen Hayes. He claims that the therapy combines ideas from CBT, behaviorism, and Buddhism. I have a lot of problems with him saying that, but we don't have time for that today. Maybe during questions if you're interested. ACT is used to treat used to help people who are experiencing a lot of different things. For example, people suffering from chronic pain disorders. The therapy doesn't claim to help minimize the actual pain that these individuals are feeling, but rather the psychological impacts, such as feelings of anger, sadness, grief at having to live with such a condition. ACT is also used to help people experiencing grief. We can think of this as the classical conception of grief, right, at loss of a loved one. We can also think of grief at loss of opportunity, maybe rejection from a school, from a job, or loss of relationship, not through death, right? We can think of a breakup, grieving a divorce, those sorts of things. It's also used to help people who are suffering from substance use disorders. What's meant to treat is really what drew me in and got me interested in the therapy, because previously I had been focusing on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is used to treat a lot of different things, but it's mainly designed to treat mood disorders. And mood disorders affect millions of people, of course, but not everyone will experience a mood disorder. But everyone, I think at least one point in their life in some way, will experience grief. So it's really, I think, important to develop the resources we have to help people experiencing grief, because in the end, that could help genuinely everyone. Now, what makes ACT different than other older forms of psychotherapy is that rather than focusing on what one can control, right, like their behavior, their emotions, ACT's real focus is on accepting the things about life that we can't control, about external circumstances, things like chronic pain disorders, right, on accepting those things and finding meaning in life and flourishing anyways, rather than on trying to control those things. Now, another interesting thing about ACT is typically psychotherapies are constructed in a way that they're very linear, right? CBT, for example, the first few weeks you do these exercises to focus on helping the patient with this thing. The next few months you spend on that. The next few months you spend on that. ACT is developed quite a bit differently, and that has these 6 core principles. And every part of the psychotherapeutic practice connects to one of these principles, if not more than that. And there's no real directionality in them. It's pretty much just what the therapist sees best for the present client, focusing on that. And if that doesn't work, moving to another core principle. And so today's presentation, I'll be specifically talking a lot more about the core principle of acceptance. So I'll come back to that in a bit. I'm so sorry. My throat is so dry. Yeah, so before diving in to what I want to talk about in how we can take ideas from Stoicism and implement them into ACT, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy. Right, so this really gets at one of the major issues I have to tackle in my thesis, this question of why use Stoicism for psychotherapy at all. A lot of answers to that question, a lot of different arguments, quite a few different histories as well. So this is just one of those. But this is another American psychologist, Albert Ellis, who developed REBT, which is sort of the father therapy of CBT. Basically, everything he developed eventually became cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's Epictetus, my third favorite Stoic. Many people's favorite, though. Very famous. Now, Albert Ellis many times in his publications, when he was publicly speaking, talked about how pretty much all of the ideas he had came up with for psychotherapy. He got from reading Epictetus. Right, so he admits that. Yeah. So he admits that, but it's also quite obvious through the work. So this is Ellis's ABC theory of cognitive disturbance. This is still pretty much the foundational theoretical idea at the core of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's actually a very simple theory. So the idea is first there's an activating event, right, which really just means any individual experience you're having, right? It could be listening to this talk, answering an email, having a dream, having a cup of coffee. Any experience can count as an activating event. Once there's A goes through B, one's personal belief system, right? So within our minds, we think about the experience, we make judgments about it, and that A going through B causes C, a consequence, right? And Ellis notes this consequence can be an emotional consequence, right? We have an experience, we think about it, we start feeling an emotion, or it can be a behavioral consequence, right? We have this experience, we think about it, we immediately take action. Ellis claims that a lot of times the consequence is usually full. Right, so this is a theoretical underpinning of CBT. And the purpose of it, right, is that if you understand this, and this is true, if we can change B, if we can change the personal belief system and the way that we judge our experiences, then in doing that, we will change C, right, the emotional and or behavioral outcomes of any given situation. And then it's quite clear where this theory came from in Epictetus, as Ellis claims that does. This is just a disclaimer. Epictetus didn't actually write any of these things. It's unclear whether or not we lost all of Epictetus's work, or he simply was focused more on the practical aspects of the teaching of philosophy and decided not to write. So everything that here and in general that's claimed to have come from Epictetus is actually just lecture notes from his students. So that's just a disclaimer. Anyways, it's quite easy to see where in the works of Epictetus Ellis was getting these ideas for his ABC theory, right? Epictetus talks about the reasoning factory, which judges the appearance of things, right? Appearance of things here, pretty sure it's just a translation of fantasia, right? Those things that we experience in life, reasoning faculty, personal belief system, bit of a modern rebranding, but same idea. Epictetus talks about how within our power, our value judgments, right, we have the ability to control the judgments we make and the values we set for ourselves. What's also in our control is whatever is in our own doing, right, whatever actions we perform. So he advises, because of those things, because we have control of those things, what we need to do is train ourselves on how we judge the appearance of things, on how we judge our experiences, right? So you can kind of see from there where Ellis brought Epictetus. Why does any of that matter? Yeah, so as I was kind of getting at earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy came out of this ABC theory. Cognitive behavioral therapy is arguably very successful as a therapy. It's considered the gold standard of psychotherapies. It's used to treat many things, and for the things it was specifically designed to treat, major depressive disorder, what we now call that, is very successful. It outperforms symptom minimization for depressive disorder. outperforms every other type of psychotherapy and a fair number of medications. Yeah, so CBT is very successful. And I kind of view all of this as proof that Stoicism and its ideas and its ontology can be modernized to improve psychotherapies. So that brings us to the main point of what I want to talk about today, which is my proposal for modernizing the idea of first movements for acceptance and commitment therapy. So first movements. So before I dive in to Seneca and all that, I just wanted to invite you all to reflect, maybe write down a note if you want to, just thinking back on your own life and your own experiences. If there's ever been a time when you were either in a situation or you received information, and before you could even have a clear thought of what was happening, oh, this is really great, oh, this is really bad, oh, I need to do X, Y, Z, before you could even have a thought like that, your body reacted in some way, right? Either your heart sped up, you began tearing up in a good or a bad way, maybe you blushed, maybe you started shaking a bit. Does anyone have an experience they would like to share?
Yeah, a good one. I think I was 16 years old, and it was the time I've lost a grandparent for the first time. And I remember about a week later, we went to visit my other grandparents, and we walked into the living room, and my granddad was laying on the couch and looked for all the world like he was dead. But that's just how he sleeps. But like you know that sort of adrenaline or whatever it is, just that sort of thing where something happens to your heart. Apparently, I went completely pale because my dad was asking if I was okay. But yeah, so that's probably the kind of thing, I suppose. There's no control over it. But I did assume he was dead because everyone was dying at that point.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, we're all definitely always dying, right? I'm glad your grandfather wasn't dead.
He's dead now.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, more for that.
Yeah, a good example.
Exactly. Exactly. So you can see exactly my point when we're talking about first movements, which I'm going to explain further, right? Immediately going pale, right? When you see something that even though you aren't thinking it, you just know is bad, or uncontrollably laughing inappropriately, right? These are the sort of things that the Stoics are getting at when they talk about first movements. So this idea of first movements, finding mainly in the work of Seneca, particularly his On Anger. Seneca is my favorite Stoic, if you were wondering why I said that about Epictetus earlier. Right, so largely in the second book, he is talking about first movements. This is a giant wall of text, and my voice is very tired. Would anyone who is more theatrical want to read this out loud?
All right, nothing which by chance drives the mind can be called an emotion. Truly, one thinks paling and falling tears and shaking limbs and heavy breathing are emotions. One is deceived and doesn't understand that these are movements of a body. The first movement is not voluntary. We are not able to escape by reason this first stab to the soul, just as your eyes close when someone jabs their fingers at them. Reason is not able to conquer these things, though perhaps reason can mitigate them with habits and constant observation.
Thank you. That was really good. Right, so this is one of the main passages where I'm taking my understanding of what first movements are. First movements is also a literal translation of, I think it's primo agitatio. So that's where the name comes from. But what can we get from Seneca, from this work, what do we learn about first movements? Well, first, clearly, first movements are bodily movements. They're bodily actions or reactions, right? It's the paling, it's the tearing up, it's the shaking of the limbs. I mean, he lists some things I think we can add a lot more, right? We can think about blushing, we can think about our heart speeding up, things of that nature. That's materially what first movements are. Now, the second thing that I think becomes extremely clear when we read Seneca is that first movements are distinct from emotions, right? That's this first part up here, right? We cannot call them an emotion, right? These first movements are something else. They're their own thing. But I think what's implicit in him drawing that distinction is the fact that these first movements happen in emotional contexts, right? Because if they didn't, if they're just something else completely, he wouldn't need to draw the distinction. No one would be becoming confused about this, right? Like, sure, my heart speeds up when I'm getting nervous or in contexts where I'm feeling angry. And right there, it makes sense if I'm confusing my heart speeding up with being angry. It doesn't make sense for him to draw this distinction if what we're talking about is my heart speeding up when I'm running on the treadmill at the gym, right? And I'm feeling pretty much nothing. Right, so that's another thing we know about first movements is they happen necessarily in emotional contexts. And then the last most important bit is that they're involuntary, right? We don't cause them. I don't say, you know what would be great for me right now? For my hand to start shaking. Let's do it, mind. Right, they're involuntary. They're something that happens to our mind, happens, as Seneca would put it, to our soul, to our bodies, not something that we cause, and they're also uncontrollable, right? He says potentially with a lot of effort, with a lot of habit, with a lot of observation, we can maybe mitigate them, but we'll never be able to fully control them through reason, which is a pretty heavy-handed thing for a Stoic to say, since they think we can control really a lot about ourselves and our actions through our reason. So that's first movement. And now, how can first movements work in acceptance and commitment therapy? I'll be talking about what this will practically look like in a little bit, but first I just want to talk about it from a theoretical point of what's going on in the theory of the therapy. So I think first movements can be interwoven into the core principle of acceptance. So what exactly is the core principle of acceptance? It's making room for unwanted private experiences. So things like emotions, memories, thoughts, making room for them, allowing them to be, instead of trying to fight them or trying to ignore them. That's what acceptance means as a core principle in this therapy. And what's the purpose of this? What's the psychotherapeutic purpose? It's to actively accept these experiences, these private experiences, so that we can practice self-compassion in relation to them, rather than some sort of harmful coping mechanism. Right, so let's say I have a very negative thought about myself. I think I'm a horrible speaker, I'm an idiot, etc., right? The point of acceptance is that instead of, right, trying to fight that, right, trying to make myself think something differently when that's in reality just what I think, or trying to ignore that thought when in reality it's just going to be there. Right, the purpose of acceptance is for me to accept that thought so I can think things like, you know, maybe I'm having this thought, it might be true, but maybe I need to be a bit easier on myself, that sort of thing, instead of immediately going for the bottle, right? Or constantly ruminating. right? Or those sorts of harmful coping mechanisms. So that is what is currently the function of acceptance within ACT. And then thinking about how can we, on the theoretical level, place first movements in here. Now, one thing is very clear is that we would have to change the theory a little bit, right? We would have to expand this top definition. Not even, yeah, we would have to expand it, but what we would have to do is get rid of this word private, right? Because first movements are absolutely not private experiences. They can be, right? Like when I'm alone and maybe I start crying or I go pale, you can think of that as a private experience. But as soon as there are other people around, the first movements are visual, right? You can see when another person is tearing up. You can see when another person is blushing or shaking or that sort of thing. So that's the part of the theory that would necessarily have to change if we were to integrate first movements into acceptance. But other than that, I think first movements fits the rest of the theory quite well. First of all, acceptance is about accepting unwanted experiences. And I think that first movements usually are unwanted experiences, right? When we're feeling angry and we start blushing and tearing up, right? We usually don't want to be doing those things. When we're nervous and our voice starts shaking, we usually don't want that, right? First movements are commonly unwanted, right? And then on a definitional level, using what scientists said, first movements can't be successfully fought or ignored, right? They are those bodily actions which necessarily reason cannot control, no matter how hard it fights or works to ignore something, right? So it fits in there. And then finally, right, I think, again, not always, but we can have harmful coping mechanisms as a result of not accepting our first movements, right? If we think about, like what I like to think about is when I get really angry, and say I'm in an argument with someone, I usually am the person who will have the first movement of tears, right? And that can lead me to have further emotions, right? Anger at myself for crying, feeling shamed for crying. These secondary negative emotions about the first movements. And if I don't cope with those emotions well, right, that can lead me to the harmful coping mechanisms, to the rumination, to the substance abuse, those sorts of things. So that's just on a theoretical level how I envision putting first movements into acceptance and commitment therapy. And now let's talk a bit about what this would look like practically. So I'm going to go through 3 psychotherapeutic techniques that are already commonly used in ACT, specifically in connection with the core principle of acceptance. And I'll be explaining each of these techniques and then talking about how they can be slightly altered to include first movements. So the first psychotherapeutic practice is called mindful naming. What it is, very simple, just labeling your emotions. What this looks like is that within a psychotherapeutic session, you would verbally label your emotions to your therapist, right? I am feeling anger, I'm having a feeling of sadness, of dread, anxiety, guilt, anything. It's just a simple practice of labeling your emotions. What's the purpose for this, right? Well, it ties back into the purpose of acceptance as a whole, since it's just a practice for acceptance, right? When you're labeling your emotions, you're making room for them. You're admitting the fact that they are there, right? Rather than trying to fight or ignore them. I think very simple practice like this would be very simple to include first movements in them in relevant psychotherapeutic contexts. So instead of just per se labeling your emotions, you could continue labeling your emotions as well as labeling the first movement, right? Instead of just saying I'm having a feeling of anger, you could say I'm having a feeling of anger accompanied by a first movement of tears. And what's the outcome of this? Well, it would lead us to accepting of these first movements, right? We recognize the fact that they're there. We're not trying to fight them. We recognize their uncontrollability, right? And so through this recognition, there's the possibility for not taking that further step of feeling shame or anger towards having them, because you're moving towards acceptance rather than these negative emotions. So then the second psychotherapeutic practice I think we could very easily involve first movements in is called normalizing. So like mindful naming, it's a pretty simple practice. The idea is basically just that you normalize your experiences, currently the other private experiences, through either a discourse with a therapist or through personal repetition on your own outside of the therapeutic session. So what this might look like in the therapy is, say I'm feeling angry. I label it, I'm feeling angry, I tell my therapist, and the therapist normalizes this feeling of anger for me, right? They say something along the lines of, you're feeling angry, that's a normal human experience. Your anger is showing, that you care about this certain thing, which is good. That just makes you an empathetic, caring human being, right? This sort of discourse, pretty much just for the purpose that even beyond just acknowledging the fact that these emotions are there, acknowledging that and pushing towards not so much a positive view of them, but a more neutral view of them. And that, yeah, they might not be pleasant to feel, but they don't make you as an individual strange. What they do is kind of just make you normal. Now, I think this sort of normalizing practice could very easily be used for first movements as well, right? The therapist can just say the same exact things about the first movement, right? You can say, tears just show you that you care in the same way we can tell someone being angry just shows that you care. And what's the outcome of this if we were to include first movements? Pretty much the same purpose is served as with regular normalizing. It's just simply that we're covering more ground, right? In addition to normalizing the emotion, we're also normalizing these uncontrollable bodily movements. And then practice number 3, the last practice I'll be talking about, is called the curious child. Now, what is this? So it's in a psychotherapeutic session, and it's kind of with the therapist guiding you. But let's say you're having an experience of an emotion, you're feeling angry. The therapist asks you to observe this emotion and asks you questions about it, right? Where are the edges of your anger inside of you? Where does the anger start? Where does it stop? Is it moving or is it still? If it's moving, is it fast or slow? All of these kinds of different questions. And the purpose is you're observing your emotion as though you were a curious child who's never seen anything like it before. Right? And again, the purpose of this, like with most practices for acceptance, is to acknowledge the experience. But also I think this practice is interesting because it can remove the emotional potency of the emotion, right? Because let's say I'm experiencing anger, and then I start doing all this observational work, and my focus shifts from whatever's making me feeling, whatever it is that's causing me to feel anger, right? The intentional object. It moves, my focus is now in figuring out the answer to all of these questions, right? So it kind of has this calming down effect. I think first movements can be used in this practice in the exact same way, right? And probably even in an easier way, right? So let's take the first movement of crying. Where are the edges of my crying? Well, they're in the literal tears. Where does it start and stop? It starts at my eyes. It stops wherever the tears are going. Is it moving or still? It's moving. A very easy practice to do with first movements. And then the outcomes again, right? We're acknowledging the first movements because we can't answer any of these questions while trying to deny the movement. And also I think it has the potential to stop an active movement, right? If I'm focused on like, where are my tears? Where did they go? Right, and answering all these observational questions, find it highly likely that I might just stop crying. And I think this really gets back to the sort of ending point that Seneca was making about first movements, right? Which is that, yeah, we can't control them, but through observation, it is possible to mitigate them. So those are the practices. Now just a few concluding thoughts. Quick summary. Right, the major question of my thesis, how can Stoic ideas and practices be used to improve acceptance and commitment therapy? One answer to this question is that ACT can integrate Seneca's ideas of first movements into their core principle of acceptance and potentially reduce negative emotional experiences, right? Those feelings of shame and anger we might have in reaction to the first movements, and reduce the bodily actions themselves, at least mitigate them in a sense. And then just some next steps for my research. So pragmatically, what I need to go home and do is write the remaining chapters of my thesis on different Stoic ideas and practices that can be modernized to improve acceptance and commitment therapies. And then to include this point about clinical testing, because it's a very common question that I get. So as I mentioned earlier, one of my supervisors, Dr. Sarah Gunn, is a professor of psychology and a practicing ACT therapist. So the plan her and I have is that once I'm finished with the thesis, or at least these chapters on different new Stoic methods for ACT, is to design a PhD project for a student in psychology to do the testing to see if these work. So I personally would not be doing any empirical work because that sounds horrible to me. It's not the sort of thing I'm interested in. But I would be supervising that and helping them to understand exactly what I meant by these practices. So that would, of course, take quite a few years to get that rolling or any real results from that. But I am looking forward to it. And yeah, a genuine big thanks to everyone who helped coordinate so that I could be here. And again, thank you all for coming to this talk today. I recognize you could have been at home and instead you chose to listen to me. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone. So we have 45 minutes for questions or discussion. Gareth? Yep.
Yeah, I kind of would like to hear why the idea that this combines CBT, behaviorism, and Buddhism sort of irritates you.
Yeah. Thank you for the platform. ACT is very clearly a derivative of cognitive behavioral therapy, so I don't really have an issue with Stephen Hayes making that point. Behaviorism, I really don't see, because not primarily, I'll go back to that slide. Yeah, not primarily acceptance, but some of the other core principles, like present moment awareness and self as context, and also, quite frankly, values and cognitive diffusion. Most of these 6 core principles are about reflection, acknowledgement, and observation of what's going on with yourself internally, primarily emotionally. So I'm not, how he believes that connects to behaviorism is very unclear for me. And then on the Buddhism point, and Stephen Hayes has admitted this himself in later publications, when he was developing this therapy, he had no idea what Buddhism was, right? Like that just says Buddhism. That doesn't say a specific school. That doesn't say the original text. It's just Buddhism. That's an incredibly broad category. Because that's all that Stephen Hayes said he was basing it off of. So really, again, like, is there some influence from probably Zen Buddhism? Sure, but not that much. I think that comes from the misunderstanding of someone very well educated in psychology and especially in clinical psychology, kind of just randomly trying to put together a philosophical framework.
Thank you.
Irene?
So I think I'm still struggling a little bit with understanding the therapy, the acceptance and commitment therapy. But basically, let me frame it in terms of the Stoic account of emotions, right? So the standard account, I mean, it's controversial whether Seneca will accept all the components, but so suppose something happens, like your grandfather dies, you have the impression, right? The fantasia that something terrible has happened. And that's not up to us. That's also not something that's under control, right? And it's not yet emotion, right? It becomes an emotion once we ascend to this rationally, saying, yeah, right, something bad has happened, right? Then we have the full, emotional reaction. And then somewhere there are also the first movements. I've never been able to figure out whether they kind of come before or after the impression, right? Somewhere there are those first movements, which you take to be bodily entirely. I think I kind of have always been a bit hesitant in this as well, but somewhere there, right? But the acceptance theory, when they ask us to accept the feelings or emotions, they are surely not asking us to accept the emotions in the Stoic sense that you can change. Or are they asking you to accept the impressions? I mean, right, that which are not under control. Like things appearing in a certain way, I can't help it. Like you might think of them as your initial thoughts popping into your head, right? You can't help it, but you're not confirming them. Or do they actually want us to accept the emotions in this highly cognitive Stoic sense, something we have assented to, saying, yeah, something terrible has happened. These Stoics wouldn't be very happy about that, right? Because you're misrepresenting the reality in this case. But now, is the theory asking us to accept this or the first impression? And then you want to say that, they should also incorporate the first movements. I got that, right? But I'm still wondering about the feeling part. What should we accept?
Very good question. There's a section of literally this paper on that question that I decided to leave out for time and interest. Also, I spent, I think it was 3 hours with my supervisor, Matt, last month with a giant whiteboard trying to draw out the impression ascent model and figure out at what point that first movements were fitting in there.
Where did you end up with this? It's not, I mean, that's a different question. Maybe we don't need to go there.
Yeah, no, but I am really interested in it. What I think happens is that there's an impression and then 2 things happen, right? One, in the irrational part of the soul is the first movement, and then the second in the rational part of the soul is the whole ascent turning into judgment, turning into emotion thing.
Okay.
That's the conclusion I came to on that. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is also not the question that you asked. but I agree, right, because of the embodied soul in Stoicism, the first movement is right like a bodily action like tears, but also like a literal movement of the soul too. So
Yeah, that could be an answer, could be both, right? Yeah.
I think it is both. I think
So we are answering all kinds of other questions along the way. But
yeah, I think it's like the soul movement that causes the bodily movement. Right.
it's still the acceptance theory and what they are asking us to accept. Yeah, but
Yeah, but the acceptance theory. No, and I do write this down within the chapter. Yeah, the issue that you're pointing out is completely, that's true. They ask you to accept emotions where the Stoic view, right, would be the Epictetus CVT bit of you can change them.
Okay, good.
Why I think,
Now I understand it better.
yeah, why I think that doesn't really matter, is you look at the work of Albert Ellis and you look at the theory underlying CVT, they wouldn't accept the first movements portion of Stoicism, right? That's why I'm suggesting it be involved in ACT, because it necessarily really wouldn't work with CVT. And so I think that's just the other side of the coin of an ACT can accept this first movement idea really well while rejecting, right, this impression, assent model of emotions.
So it has a very non-Stoic aspect in it, basically, the theory as such. Okay.
So the way I understand your question was, what is it that the ACT theory asks us to accept? For example, when, let's say I have a strong emotional experience, so what is it that I should accept? So I don't think they ask us to accept that the way the world appears to us through this emotion is true or something like that, but simply to accept that we have this experience and not, have a secondary emotion, becoming angry or becoming embarrassed about having this experience. So simply accept I have this kind of experience, and then it's like, okay, let's see whether it's true, what can I do about it, instead of attacking yourself. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, I think that's correct. It's about accepting more so internally in the core principle of acceptance about what's going on internally with you, whether that be like a memory or a thought you're having or an emotion.
Simply take this as an experience and not as, telling you something about what is really the case.
So maybe it is a question about what acceptance means,
Yes.
right? So it's not that I'm, right. It's more about okay, I'm not fighting against it, but maybe I'm going to change it ultimately, right? You can build the stuff on top of it, right?
Where the other core principles come in.
So maybe that's a key notion to be explained for non-specialists, right? Because I think I got stuck with this part. I was like,
Yeah. No, it's very difficult because it's the name of this core principle, and that's really what I'm aiming at, is like acceptance as this core principle, not like as a huge idea within Stoicism.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I'm not a specialist in it, but I'm looking for a role of how actually we can just say a little bit about my background, where I struggle with moral emotions, is that they play a role in our disagreements, and very often it's very interesting to think about actually how these values-based disagreements can be perhaps solved when we change things. So this is why just instead of just hate, you get compassion or pity or something. So this is my background, how I'm looking. So what I found there interesting is that at the moment, I don't remember exactly the context. You were telling also that not only acceptance, but also pointing out that there can be this kind of self-compassion also. that, and just to connect now what Rina and Vivian were saying, so just to understand what is acceptance and what can be a step further, or what happens then, because as I understand, acceptance can also mean not to be judgmental to yourself. I mean, it's just like you see the flow. I mean, just also today, the mindfulness programs have taken this over, just saying, just look at those emotions like passing, and they are coming back. You have your sorrow, you have your grief, but it comes next time not so strong. It will be milder, and you perceive it, or you experience it again and again. And am I correct? My first question is that this acceptance actually means not to just to perceive your emotions in coming and disappearing perhaps, or becoming milder, and then actually not to judge yourself, not to be judgmental, just to let them go. But now another context was, can you remind me or tell about this thought that you can also take some kind of emotional stance, but this is about just like looking at yourself from a different perspective and pitying, because if you have self-compassion, you just have already another imaginative person judging yourself again, but not judging in a negative sense, but just having like, oh you dear, having this kind of thing, this is really a bad thing, and you imagine, build some kind of another meta level where you look at yourself, but with compassion actually. So how is this mechanism going? And the question really is this also changing your emotion? Or is it like only helping you to accept and helping you to live with it? Or does it lead also, or can lead also, to changing a different, having a different emotion even about your own things that you are going through?
Yeah, thank you. That was a really great question. I think the therapy doesn't want to claim that it can change your emotions. So it goes with the lower level claim of you can accept them. Of course, right, if it's being used to help someone who's experiencing grief, and over time they experience less grief or stop grieving, right? Of course, that's the aim, that's a good thing. What you're saying about self-observation and the second, sort of like second person, your mind watching your mind, that's pretty much like the perfect explanation of the core principle of self as context, right? And again, like all of these core principles are very much connected with each other. So there's a lot of practices psychotherapeutically where you practice being that observer to your own mind and your own emotions, right? And then different ways in which you can connect that with values, with committed action, changing the way that you behave, right? Trying to accept the things that you see when you're doing that observation. So that's like very fundamental to the therapy. And then, yeah, to answer your questions on what is acceptance, like strictly in this act, context as a core principle is literally, the acceptance is literally just the paying for and the allowing to be, not necessarily any sort of assent or anything like that, just the allowing to persist without trying to fight them in any way, the private experiences. Right, and so then the idea of accepting these experiences is so that you can practice self-compassion. But a lot of that actual self-compassion happens through the other core principles of the therapy. And so this principle is really more so just paving the way to make that possible. Does that make sense?
Just to be clear, isn't it also in this sense then actually changing emotion? Because for example, instead of shame, you will have compassion or self-compassion. There is something that seems to be happening. What is exactly the focus of your attention or targeted intentionally?
Yeah. So I think in cases where what you're accepting is an emotion, it's not changing that fundamental emotion that you're accepting, right? It's not changing that anger or that sadness, but it's practicing self-compassion in these different therapeutic ways so that you don't have a secondary negative emotion because of that original one. So you don't feel that shame at your anger or even more anger at your anger and that sort of thing. So I don't think it changes that like first instance core emotion that you're accepting, but rather the possible outcomes of it.
So perhaps you can change the intensity and the duration of the
Certainly, yeah.
Siobhan.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really interesting. I'd never heard of ACT as this acceptance and commitment therapy. And I think following up on Margaret's question, I seem to be stuck between exactly this part of so you can practice self-compassion instead of harmful coping mechanisms. Of this idea that one can be sort of observing oneself and noticing the emotions, but what happens? How can one decide that one needs to also change? And of course, while I was listening to you, probably know the serenity prayer, right? Right. So this is where I wonder how can ACT go beyond what I would say is one of the really very powerful serenity prayer. So that serenity prayer comes from Alcoholics Anonymous. I come from a lot of alcoholics in my family, so this is a prayer that's always said a lot, you know. So God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I do think there's something really powerful in this prayer, not just because it's been hammered into me in many, many examples, but that how does one distinguish between the behavior, emotions, first movements that one experiences and that one cannot change? In this case with alcoholism, that one is helpless around alcohol, but it can be an illness or being with a person who's harmful to one. And then the ability to have the courage to change with what one can, one's attitude towards drinking, towards an illness, towards a person that might be harmful to them, so that they have the wisdom to know where they might be able to have life changes and where they simply can't. And so that's where I'm kind of stuck here, because when you gave the examples of mindful naming, okay, the naming I could follow through with the serenity prayer, but the normalizing, well, wait a second, the normalizing, how then can one make the leap or distinguish between behavior that one might be able to change and not fall back into saying, well, that's just how that's normal and I can change. So where is the wisdom to know the difference between? So how does one go from mindful naming to that normalizing? I think I got stuck in the normalizing to the curious child. Is the curious child the moment when we might be able to distinguish? Is that the moment?
I think the answer is a bit more complicated, although I can see a version of the curious child playing out that's useful in making those distinctions. I think, yeah, probably the most important part is that what's being accepted, right, is necessarily these private experiences, right? It's a thought, it's a memory, it's it's the anger. It's never, right, a behavior. like, for example, alcoholism, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of why they like in all of the right, like the textbooks, the literature on this, I read, it's very, very clearly that, and not right, we're not accepting negative, harmful behaviors. So I would say partially the
So that
answer.
normalization, sorry, is not accepting that negative.
Yeah, it wouldn't be normalizing any sort of unhealthy behavior, right? Whether that be rumination, drinking, yelling at your partner, whatever. It would simply be normalizing, right? It's really just about normalizing emotions. So it's saying if you're feeling sad, that's a normal human emotion. That's not something to feel ashamed of. If you're feeling angry, everyone feels angry sometimes. That's okay. Where I think the wisdom that comes in is in the values core principle. So this core principle usually comes up a bit later in the psychotherapy. And I think it's very interesting from an ethical perspective, but it's really about the client patient working with the therapist to determine what it is they value in life in terms of what brings meaning and feelings of fulfillment into their life, and then committed actions as another core principle is pretty much, you know, like how to live according to those values, and a lot on never giving up and always trying again with every failure and that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, I think that wisdom, you know, probably comes in there. And then last thing I just wanted to add, there's this really interesting paper by Pigalucci where he talks about the Stoic influence on the Serenity Prayer in particular. Which is not important, but fun.
Great, thank you.
It's very often used in the context of Stoic. Like people think that's an essentially Stoic thing to say. Yeah, make it power.
All right, so I would like to touch upon this labeling practice. And I'm just wondering, what's this difference between if they usually talk about labeling the emotion, and now you say that we should label the first movement. And I'm just wondering that perhaps normally when they say that you label the emotion is understood in the more modern sense, so that it includes many different components, not in this like highly Stoic sense of this very, very cognitive thing. But so the idea that I want to emphasize is that usually, at least how I understand it, when they say that you label your emotion, like you label it as anger or fear, you group quite a lot of symptoms together under this kind of emotion. And so this labeling is also a kind of grouping action, a categorization action. Whereas when you say that you label the first movement, then it seems that it's not that much a matter of like grouping a bigger whole together, but it's like picking out like a single movement or a tear or a specific sensation. And I am wondering if labeling these different types of things has different functions, because labeling as a kind of grouping activity is also something that Lisa Feldman Barrett talks a lot about in her psychological constructionist theory. And as I understand her, she thinks that there is this kind of special usefulness in kind of grouping these syndromes together and just giving it a name of the emotion. So it's very much about a grouping activity. And I mean, there are many studies about how this means that if you learn to group, if you learn to label your emotions, then you will better cope and so on and so on. And I wonder if part of that is because you group those kind of symptoms together. But now, if we want to also label just the first movements or pick out some individual sensations, I'm wondering that perhaps it works in a different way, or perhaps it has some kind of different function, because one is a matter of grouping together, the other is a matter of breaking the emotion into parts, at least for how many people understand the word emotion. So yeah, I'm wondering if there is more to be said about these different types of labeling activities and how and why they actually work and they are so useful for people.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Where is it? Here it is. Yeah, so I see, and this is something that I write quite a bit about, right? Which is in philosophy, we have these hundreds of years of debate, right? Thousands even, on what emotions are, what can be grouped together to be said to be part of what emotions are or of individual emotions. But looking at it from this acceptance and commitment therapies perspective, it is necessarily like psychology and clinical psychology at that. What they're necessarily talking about is like that private experience of emotions, right? It's very clearly that like cognitive private part, right? Because this is a specific acceptance and commitment therapy practice for the purpose of their core principle of acceptance, if that makes sense. Right, and where are they trying to accept necessarily private experiences? So it's very, maybe I'm not explaining this super well, but it's very clear that what they're talking about here is necessarily not first movements. So that's kind of what's coming in. And I think in addition to that, right, like the purpose of labeling is different in different psychotherapies, right? And I do agree with you. I think in some psychotherapies, the purpose is for that grouping, but I think the purpose specifically in acceptance and commitment therapy is really just, right, like as it says, instead of trying to group them, trying to make room for them, to have them out in the open. I mean, sometimes depending on the client or the patient, their ability to name the emotion that they are experiencing, right? Because not everyone can naturally do that, or has experience doing that for whatever reason. So I think the function of labeling within this context isn't grouping, it's really just that letting them be, right, rather than taking a different sort of action towards them, if that makes sense.
Okay. And begin.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this self as context. Can you say a bit more about that? Just wondering whether there might be a link to Buddhism in there.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, definitely all of the core principles are like very heavily linked together. And I really only talked about acceptance. But self as context is kind of just there's something else that they also call it, but the name's not coming to mind. But pretty much it's just observation of your internal self, like exactly what Margaret was talking about earlier. Try and take this third person perspective on your own mind. Maybe like taking a minute to breathe and then seeing what pops up for you. What thoughts are you having? Are you having any emotions? What are they? Where do the thoughts lead? So not that like active engaging and thinking, but just observing what comes through your mind. And that, right, all of the core principles link together, but I think the clearest way that links with acceptance, right, which is that if you're not aware even of what's going on in there, of what those thoughts are, of what those emotions are, well, you can't accept and acknowledge them because you're not even clear on what's going on. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether they have a particular understanding of what a self is in mind, or it's just, it doesn't really matter. Because, in all schools of Buddhism, they have a lot of issue with the self. But it's the basic teaching is the teaching of non-self, that what we take ourselves to be, there's no essence there. There's nothing permanent in there. It's just ever-changing processes, and that's it. I'm just wondering whether there's any link to this idea, but I guess they have a different thing in mind.
Yeah, no, actually, I wrote a different chapter on exactly the idea of no self, because when Stephen Hayes brings in Buddhism, he claims as a major influence because of the self as context. The idea is that, the thoughts you're thinking, the emotions you're experiencing, those will change over time, right? But part of the point of self as context is this third person point of view that's completely stable. That's always there. That's consistent when no one else is. And therapeutically, that can be like comforting, right? To have this stability. But in the context of Buddhism, makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I arrived quite late, so maybe you touched upon this, and I apologize then. But I'm thinking like including first movements in the ACT therapy. I think you acknowledged also that those first movements can be over time changed, right? And I like wonder, like sometimes at least just accepting first movements, there's kind of issue of like maybe this being counterproductive, given that actually over long time you can practice and practice and practice. Like my a friend of mine is a neuroscientist and speaks with authority for me, so I trust him too much. Claims that when it comes to, for instance, phobias, then let's say spider phobia, then what actually works is this kind of behaviorist approach, where you basically just first expose yourself to rubber spider, and then I don't know, slowly starts to like move closer to real spider and so forth. I don't know, it's right, it's actually effective, but at least it looks, I mean, maybe at least it looks like sometimes this kind of more, I don't know, more how to say, behaviorist approach to like changing your first movements might be feasible. And so if that's the case, then it looks like maybe accepting your first movements is kind of actually counterproductive, because you might give up too easily on actually trying to control them in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah, fair question. Needs a clarification on my point. Sorry, I also got very distracted because I'm like horribly afraid of spiders, like severe arachnophobia. So I got down that train. I think exposure therapy, specifically in the treatment of severe phobias, works really well from like the bit. I mean, I've never focused on studying exposure therapy, but it seems to work quite well for phobias. So no disagreement with that. ACT is certainly not a therapy for treating phobias whatsoever. But I think the thing that I definitely should have clarified is that this is not about accepting first movements in general. It's not accepting, I'm a person who gets angry and cries, and that's just what it is. It's in the moment of when I'm experiencing a specific first movement, it's accepting the fact that that is what is happening and what's going on for me, not accepting that, oh, it's always going to be like that and it can never change. but that's what's happening right now, so that A, I'm aware of that's what's happening. B, that I can start feeling compassion for myself rather than being really angry or even ruminating, right, on that sort of negative thought. Like, I'm the person who cries when I get angry, and that's never going to change, and that's one of the reasons why I'm horrible, and I'm in this whole cycle. Is that
Yeah, I'm not sure how to push it forward, so thanks.
I mean, I have little question about like, so by labeling our emotion, like we can recognize the reality and uncontrollability of experience, which result in a lack of further shame or anger. It is correct is as this, but sometimes like someone can think like, oh, I cannot control this, so I will give up. Like, so I will just do what I want to do, like that, maybe. So he just give up to make up this kind of better action, and maybe it can result in more shame or more anger, I think. Sometimes is it understandable that what I'm meaning?
Yeah, that maybe you'll just practice the acceptance, and then, but that what that will result in is just kind of this, not thinking of a more academic way to say it, this like fuck it attitude,
Yeah,
and then just
yeah.
heading down a harmful path.
And so like I think labeling emotion actually has this kind of, I don't know, like force to fix this kind of reaction. Maybe I was wondering about it.
So you think it could go either way, but you're worried about it going the negative way?
I mean, like I know, like while I was labeling my emotion, I can recognize my reality more precisely. But sometimes I cannot be sure my labeling emotion is actually true, and my recognition of reality is actually true, like whether it is true or not. Sometimes, so like that makes me. I didn't.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it might distort our behavior, maybe. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. That's a good point. I think if we were just doing these acceptance practices like in a void, definitely has the potential to go sideways. But I think what's important to remember is this is within a very specific therapeutic context, right? So first of all, like there's another person there, right? There's a trained psychotherapist there. So if there's needs for like reassurance or redirection, further understanding, clarification, right? That resource is there. That's what the therapist is for the most part. But then there's also, right, these other principles, or these other practices. So I think kind of what you're getting at, we can think about as like a mixture of what cognitive diffusion, maybe selfless context, maybe present moment awareness would be used for, right? That like understanding of what your actual experiences are and gaining that confidence in yourself that you are the authority on labeling your emotions, right? Because they are private experiences. No one knows that what is going on better than you do. Yeah. So I think there can definitely be risks. Yeah, if this were to be practiced in isolation from other therapeutic methods or isolation from other people, but I think those are mitigated.
Yeah. Irene? Right. I had a follow-up on Haiti, I think earlier, just very quickly. The idea was that I think it was related to my earlier question that when we accept the emotion, why it's important to clarify what the emotion is. And then I asked, oh, is it in the Stoic sense, this constructivist sense, or cognitive kind of a way of understanding the emotion? Because I think there is also this very widespread understanding of an emotion where an emotion includes what Seneca calls first movements, right? So when you're feeling grief, you're feeling something very bodily, and that is what an emotion. If you ask someone identify an emotion, they would point to what one calls first movement. In which case, they're already included, right? Yeah. So maybe, yeah, that's something so that you're not otherwise you might think that you're breaking into an open door. It's like, okay, the emotions. It's just to clarify that what you mean by no emotion. Well, in a later version of the paper.
Yeah, I think what makes it very, very clear, right, and the psychologists are not as
They don't work with the everyday notion or
right. They're not as precise, right? This is also how he's got into trouble with Buddhism. They're not as precise as we are philosophically. But what's very, very clear in the literature is that what we are accepting are private experiences, and there's a list of what these private experiences include. And one of those things is emotion. I think from there, right, do we have a precise definition of what acceptance and commitment therapists or theorists are talking about when they say emotion? No. But we do have a lot of clarity on that what they are talking about is necessarily private.
and not necessarily as much bodily or
Unclear, right? If
you assume
if my legs started to right, no one noticed.
Mhm.
That's unclear, but it's necessarily not the first movements as Seneca describes them, because that's public, right? Like hailing, that's public. Okay, public. Shaking limbs, public. Heavy breathing, public. So
I don't know. Some are such if you feel a shock, right? You're not necessarily acting it out public. Maybe you do. I don't know. Okay, I see. So you get there by private public distinction. Okay.
yeah, I think the shock, like the stab to the soul, that is what he literally writes. I think that gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which is in that the first movement is kind of two things, right? It's a movement of the irrational part of the soul that causes like then a more bodily movement.
Difficult bit.
Yes, two comments, and one links to this, that what you said, and also this spider phobia comment. And I thought when I was hearing, I don't come from philosophy, so I don't know things. I come from linguistics and now semiotics. That when I hear first movement, I would like to add the concept of like nervous system, for instance, because I know this, for instance, like taking myself as an example. A year when I was very stressed, I had much more first movements when things happened. I had like a stronger experience, and when I'm more relaxed, I have less of first movements, it seems, or like I have less of affects in my body when the same thing happens. And the second thing I was thinking about was if you will in your thesis like mentioning about where ACT is situated, because I don't say it's kind of that we now live in a kind of in a world where everyone is like in this like neoliberal frame of having to take care of themselves, and we need to take care of our own health things, and then we find a therapist who says, okay, accept everything, then you can be calm. It sounds like very much like this. I mean, to kind of provoke a bit, I mean, this kind of like mindfulness therapy made in a commercial frame, when you apply like Buddhist-like practices for actually like only feeling good yourself, and you exclude the whole context of the social and economical reality that we live in, for instance. So I wondered, like, I don't know what ACT is, but will you in some way like touch upon this? Like, is this is somehow situated in the world that we live in, and that is kind of deciding how we can create balance within ourselves or not?
Yeah, I think, no, those are interesting questions. on the first point, about what you're saying, I think that gets at what Seneca is actually saying here about habits, right? Like there is something habitual about these first movements. I think that works both ways, right? If they're super common or they're super uncommon in relation to what's going on. I also think thinking about Stoic ontology, which I did not really go into at all here, in relation to what we currently know about the central nervous system is very, very interesting, because they believed in a embodied soul, right? And that the soul was actually spread out throughout the entire body. Okay, that just sounds like the central nervous system, right? I don't know. I've always thought there's something of it there. So I'm very interested in it. Yeah, I definitely, in the introductories, to get to the second point, the introductory chapters, sections, part of my thesis, right, this is not like a solve all. We're not solving everyone in the world's grief in every single instance of a substance use disorder, and everyone with a chronic pain condition is not going to be content and fulfilled. Absolutely, absolutely not, right? This is a very Western practice, right? It originated by an American, and it's a therapy that's really taking off primarily in the UK, and it's doing very successfully there. So there are limitations on that, right? There's also, no matter where this is, there would be class limitations on it, right? Like it's very difficult getting the healthcare, having enough therapists, like there's so many practical issues. So I don't think in any ways this is solve all for any of the world's issues. Rather, I'm just trying to improve the therapy for the people who will have the ability to access it, who are currently accessing it, and who will find it useful, right? Because that's still a fair amount of people, and with how it is taking off in the UK, a growing number of people, right? Because in addition to people using the therapy, there's also a growing number of people studying the therapy and becoming the specific kind of therapist, right? So I guess that's just terms of impact. I mean, the other side of it, right, is that there's a fair amount of people who don't go to therapists, maybe because they don't want to, maybe because they can't access, et cetera, logistical issues. But there are, right, these textbooks on this therapy are publicly available, right? There are versions that are written more as self-help books of this therapy, right, that are a bit more accessible. And I think that the work I'm doing could also impact those, which hopefully will expand things a bit more. I mean, really, yeah, there's a ton of issues. I think a lot of it is how healthcare systems are set up, as well as yeah, I mean, I think that's primarily it, which is also an economical issue, and I'm just a philosophy student. I can't fix this.
Yeah. Just have a last question because we run out of time.
Yeah, sorry, just again, also having my own thoughts about I was just thinking now, my final question would be, what do you think is the actual aim of the therapy? Because I was just like thinking that on the first level, you can have like, you seem to be saying that, okay, there are first impressions, there is emotion or feeling. I mean, this is coming. You should make room for it. Just accept it, allow it, and then label it. I mean, just like, and then the second thing is that you are developing an emotion about the emotion, that you are coming as your examples, like I'm ashamed, I'm not asking a good question at the moment. And then I start to judge myself. I am ashamed of not being why I am either just pitying yourself or something like this. So what is exactly happening isn't it so that in the therapy you you try to convince a person, or theoretically, that the first impressions or feelings, these are normal. Let them go. Try to perceive them from outside, in the sense, just like observe them coming. The flower, your tears are flowing. Go and take a shower. I mean, they go away, and so on. You just don't try to intervene. This is normal. It's happening to you. You label it. You say, this is my grief, or this is my thing. But you stop actually judging them, or judging yourself, actually, your emotions, because this causes additional pain. You are either just criticizing yourself, or you are starting to regret why I am so, and so on. So actually what the therapy is doing is stopping to be judgmental about yourself. And why I came to this thought was that I was today reading an interesting article about AI. Why is it the chatbots, why are they so popular? Because they are not judging you. They are all the time telling you this is okay how you are, even if you are a different person, and then you feel better. I mean, they are doing this therapy, just telling you it's okay to be afraid of spider. This is okay of just feeling sorrow. Accept it, it goes away, and that's it. It's the help, actually. So am I right about it? That actually what the therapy is doing, avoiding you to be judgmental about yourself, and then everything, the emotions that, or the feelings that you're having, they become lighter when time passes. Everybody knows it. The more you talk about your grief, the less you feel. This time goes on, it passes. Only don't judge yourself. Stop thinking about it. Stop being actually having a value judgment about your emotion. I would say this is the problem. Is this so easy?
No. I think that is part of it, right? The purpose of acceptance and commitment therapy overall is very distinctly to live a fulfilled and meaningful life, whatever that means to you as an individual, no matter what your context is, right? What your situation is, what the exterior things you really cannot control are. That's the purpose overall of the therapy, right? And a lot of these first four core principles, acceptance included, are really setting the groundwork for you to be able to successfully engage with your values and your committed action that really, I think, kind of like get you across the finish line, right? Of having that meaningful, fulfilling life, right? That comes when you know what your values are and you're acting in a way that's in accordance with them. So it's, as a whole, I think the therapy is a lot more than just me to chat GPT saying I'm sad, and the little bot being like, that's okay, Liz. It's fine. So I think the therapy is really distinctly a lot more than that. And I think, but I think part of it is the not judging yourself, right? I think that comes in a lot with what they call cognitive diffusion, right? Which is this move from I'm angry, and now I'm ashamed of myself for being angry, and that turns into thoughts, identities I hold about myself of like, I'm a bad person, I'm not worthwhile, I'm a coward, whatever negative self-thought you can have. It's judgmental to stop you from going down that path, but not judgmental to stop you from going down the path of like, that there are ways I can better myself and improve myself. And even though anger is a normal human emotion, that doesn't mean it's okay for me to be angry all the time. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think we should stop here. Yeah, thank you.